Hello and welcome to Seen Differently, an episode that I'm really looking forward to because we're going to have Angela Scott with us. And the topic I'd like to discuss with her today is what is actually enough? You have been in many roles, in client-facing roles, in senior roles across go-to-market at big companies. You spent there over 20 years, but now you have a portfolio career. So you're a strategic advisor, you're an executive coach, you are a writer, and you have also your own podcast. And you ponder about a topic which I found utterly interesting, which is to understand what is actually enough. What you will get out of this episode is, first of all, not to confuse ambition with what's enough, but to understand what could potentially be your finish line. Because ambition without finish is just being stuck on a treadmill. Angela, welcome to this podcast, and thank you so much for allowing me to ask you a couple of questions about this fascinating topic.
It's really nice to be here, and I feel very honored to be one of your first guests.
Angela, we met a couple of, months, quarters ago. It feels almost years.
Yeah, I think it was. Yeah.
Yeah. I think I reached out to you because when I started my consulting business, I thought Angela's already out there. She works with companies I quite admire. And I just were curious to see how the business works. And then I learned more about you and understood that you had, quite similar to me, this history of working in corporate jobs. But these days, you run your own company. I would really love to understand what made you leave the corporate world behind you.
So for me, it wasn't just one thing. It was a gradual build-up of signals, I would say, that I wasn't unhappy where I was, but that something was changing in me. And that's one of the reasons why I called my podcast Change Unfiltered, because I am definitely still going through that transition, which took me away from corporate life. For me, it became increasingly clear that I didn't have enough choice. And as much as I enjoyed the roles that I was doing, I was very often pigeonholed into being in a role rather than delivering something that people really needed. And I remember quite often people would say to me things like, what are you interested in that thing over there for? Because I'm just a very curious person. But that wasn't really rewarded in the environments that I worked in. So that was one of the major triggers that brought me to where I am.
And I mentioned that before, you are also an executive coach and a strategic advisor. Let's talk about your work as coach. Who are your clients and why are your clients come to you normally?
Well, it's quite interesting actually, because I kind of fell into this by accident. And I say that a little bit facetiously because it is probably something that I've been passionate about for a long time. My clients are typically people that are at a specific inflection point. I'm a very good crisis manager or leader, and that shows up in my executive coaching as well, because if you're someone that just wants to get your next role or your next promotion, I'm probably not the coach for you. But if you're looking at your career and saying, is this it? Or what's coming next? Then I like to get the layer beneath all that surface level stuff. So typically my clients are anywhere between sort of late 30s and late 50s, actually quite broad, because I don't think this is age dependent, but they are people who've reached an inflection point, or I guess a burning platform that they've come across. It can be either be personal or professional, and they go, I can't carry on like this. Something needs to change. And it can be someone who most of my clients are in the technology sector because that's my network and that's my background. But sometimes I end up working with someone who, for example, has been out of the workforce and wants to get back into the workforce, but they don't want to go back into the role that they were doing. So lots of people who maybe have maternity leave, for example.
When you transition out of corporate and now running your own advisory, your coaching business, your writer, your podcast, It sounds quite a lot, but
Yeah.
are there any trade-offs?
Well, I think this is the misconception that I had when I started, is that I suddenly needed to carry on being busy. So that is I guess to answer the first part of your question about being busy, I'm not as busy as people think I am because I choose who I want to work with. I don't say yes to everything. To answer your trade off question, yes, of course, there are trade offs. Sometimes I think, oh, I really miss being in that team. But actually, no, I don't miss being on a Zoom call 15 times a day with people that I don't really want to spend time with. So there is a trade off in terms of monthly salary, of course, as well, because your income tends to be a bit more lumpy. But that is, again, an active choice. And I think when you look at your career, sometimes we have a temptation to just look at that in terms of showing up for work, doing our job, and then the private life is kind of in a separate box. What I now think of my life like is, well, actually, I'm not treating my private life as some sort of pressure cooker release, because that's what it used to be like, right? Going on the expensive holidays, coming back and thinking, oh no, I've got to read my emails. Now I think the trade off is the wrong way of looking at this, actually. It's not actually a trade off for me, anyway. It's an intentional way of living, whereas I was operating very much more on autopilot, at least until into my, my mid late 40s, because that's what everyone does, unless they've made a conscious decision not to do so.
Why do you
Yeah.
think so many folks of us, of our generations, do still or run on autopilot?
I think we're very good at solving problems, and that's what's rewarded in organizations. So you can quite easily move from one problem to the other and get a sense of achievement, particularly when it's validated by someone outside. You you close this deal and you close the next deal and you close the next deal. Or maybe you're finishing a consulting project if you're a consultant, or maybe you are working with this client and you get them live. Whatever you're doing, you can quite easily wake up 3 years later and go, what actually happened in that period? I'll give you an example. I spoke to someone yesterday and I asked her, do you keep a record of your achievements and how do you do that if you do that? And she said, you know what? I kind of celebrate it for a day and then I move on.
Mm.
And I recognize that in myself. That's exactly what I used to do. So I think the reason why we end up on autopilot isn't a conscious decision. It's just because we get swept along. And quite often I talk about something called the lazy river. And I
Hmm.
don't mean that in a derogatory way at all. What I mean is, it's quite a nice view from this river. Imagine being like in an amusement park and you're in one of those rubber rings and you're just being swept along. Not a bad experience, but you have very little agency. And that's why I think it's very easy to end up on autopilot, because actually, a lot of the time, you don't realize you're on autopilot until you look back in retrospect.
Remember, we both decided a couple of months ago to run something like a customer success get together in London,
Yeah.
in Paddington. And I think we're now 3 meetings in. That started with having a location where we just come in with no agenda and opening up this construct we are in, this kind of showing up, having an ego, having a badge, functioning or running down this lazy river on our rubber kind of floater and just share a little bit. What else is there? So what kind of motivations do we have? Why are we actually here? What are we seeking? So what are your experience so far out of our get-togethers in Paddington? What do you see in particular in folks who show up?
So, what's been really interesting for me from that experience was I actually started that as a way to connect with people on my own terms. And what I mean by that is I was quite sick of going to networking events. Um, there's a particular one in my area here, I'm the southwest of England, where you show up and you have to hold an egg timer and give your little pitch about what you do. And I was like, oh, this is so cringe. And I'm actually not meeting anyone interesting here. So that's why I decided to do that myself. My experience of those events has been very positive. I've had some much deeper conversations coming out of those than, and you and I, in fact, met for the first time through that event. So I think it's been much more positive than leaving it to chance. And it's one of my pillars that's very important to me is connection. Because as I mentioned earlier, that's one of the things I do miss is working with colleagues. But I've created that myself by staying in contact with people that I genuinely want to maintain a relationship with. I have a former colleague, Sarah Eklund. I'll give her a shout out. She and I have worked together several times now because we have chosen to come back together after our corporate careers and work on an advisory project together. So that makes a huge difference, and that's why I think those events are valuable. Because it's about, again, it's about the agency that you go in and you're like, you know what? I'm going to turn my autopilot off for a minute and I'm just going to be open to whatever conversations are coming up.
When we talk with these people in our get togethers, I like to ask them a question, which is actually, what are you optimizing for in your life? Because I feel sometimes take the rules that we learn in our corporate or in our business life and apply them to our personal life. What am I actually optimizing in my career? So I would love to understand, what is your experience? What are they optimizing for? Is that a question they actually start asking themselves?
I don't think people start with that question because that's kind of like the downstream, or even actually, if you turn it on its head, you can think about that this is the upstream question. The kind of questions I guess that people are asking first is, why do I not feel comfortable? What's wrong? Because that's the symptom that they see first. So typically someone won't come and go, I need to optimize my life. It's a bit like saying, my house is a bit untidy at the moment. If you've just met someone, I doubt whether people really want to admit that. Maybe it's just me. My house is very untidy, apart from this room. So I think typically what you will get in answer to that question, I'd be curious to understand what you've heard. But when I first meet coaching clients or potential coaching clients, and I ask them a similar question to that, like, what are you looking to focus on over the next year? Which is a slightly different way of wording it, but it's still, what do you want to work on, right? What do you want to make better? They'll typically immediately start talking about their job and how they want to perform better. When actually, when I then get further into working with them, it becomes very clear that they're not that bothered about the next promotion. They just feel that they need to perform to get it, like a little performing monkey. And what they want is something entirely different. And that's why I said earlier, when I'm working with people, if they're pretending to me, I can spot it a mile off. Like, you're not being authentic, telling me what you think I want to hear.
Yeah.
It's about this link between performance and external validation. Very difficult for us when we've been in roles and, you get a promotion and it's like, oh, here's a pay rise, or you've done this project, kudos, big clap. That's very addictive for some people.
Yeah, my experience is quite similar. I remember the very first time when I asked somebody, it's like a CSM at that time, said like, hey, the situation at the moment is a bit difficult, and they were actually looking for a new role as a customer success manager. I said like, what's your plan B? And they almost were in shock. And I said like, oh, what do you mean with plan B? It's like, do you have anything else that you would potentially do? Or are you still considering doing this? Because, it's a great time to also reflect on if there's anything else. And then that's an interesting thing. They paused and then they started to tell me a little bit about what they actually really like to do. And I could see instantly, we were a group of 4. He was radiating and he was basically taking people on this journey, and you could see the passion. Sometimes we got stuck in this world and it's almost like becoming a bit blunt or dull.
So Thomas, I think we need to just be real for a moment, because we've both been in the position that a lot of your listeners have been in. I worked in revenue generating roles and strategic and program roles for over 20 years. in organizations that were very tough and very aggressive. And what we're talking about here is showing up in a way that will not be rewarded. Not in those organizations typically. There will always be individual leaders who recognize that, but as a culture and organization, I'm increasingly hearing that that is very difficult. So I'm not surprised that you had that conversation with that individual because we are conditioned for performance and for achieving goals. And it's very different when we start talking about, well, what do we value? What is it that actually we're passionate about? One thing I often say to people is if you had any choice in the world, even as much as you like parts of your job, or some people love all parts of their job, right? But would you still choose this particular role? And I challenge anyone listening to really think about that question.
I also want to talk to you about another topic, and this is what's on the one hand side enough, but also why we shouldn't confuse this with settling.
So I think this is a massive misconception that somehow saying enough means, well, I'm settling for some sort of situation. And I think anyone that knows me that's listening to this will know I'm not a settler, 100% not a settler. So when we're saying enough, I don't want the next promotion. I don't want to carry on in this career. I want to do something different. We're not saying I don't care anymore because that implies, oh, I'm just going to settle for what I've got, right? We're actually saying, no, I want to do this differently. I want to turn this on its head. I want to pick up this thing that I've been carrying around, whether, that's your role, the organization that you've ended up in. I'm going to turn it on its side and have a look and figure out, is this the thing that I want to carry on carrying, or do I want to do something different? So it's about being a bit more deliberate, a bit more intentional, but definitely not about settling. And I think that's a huge challenge, but once you get it, it's almost like I often say to my coaching clients, it's a bit like opening a door and stepping through it and then realizing, actually, even if I wanted to go back, I can't now because I've seen what I've seen.
If people are now listening to this podcast episode and they think like, I have my job, I've got my mortgage, where should I actually start to think about what could be enough? What advice would you give them?
Well, it's interesting if I think about the two types of clients that I work with, and I often think people see these as very different, but actually they are often the same person. It might be a CRO who is employing me to work in his business or her business, or it might be someone who is working with me because they want to move to a different chapter of their career. I think my advice is said in a slightly different way because it's a different context. But ultimately, it's around building a structure that makes what's going on make more sense. And there's something actually I'd like to share with you because there is a structure that I think is helpful if you'll humour me, Thomas.
Absolutely. Go
I
for
actually
it.
have it on my phone because I add to this all the time. There are 5 pillars that I would encourage people to think about just in terms of how people could make a start on looking at where their life is now. And I think these are really important, whether you're still in a corporate career, whether you're already decided that you want to do something else, whether you're thinking about moving organizations. These create a level of integration in your life rather than just thinking about balance. So there are 5 things: health, creativity, peace, connection, and growth.
I would love to dive with you into these different pillars and understand each of them and to make it very, very tangible. I would like to start with health. So what does it mean for you? How do you define enough when it comes to health?
So rather than thinking about this in terms of, I must have lots of things in each category, and health is a very good one to start with. The temptation is to think, I need to be doing, I need to be doing running. I need to be doing cycling, maybe swimming as well. Or maybe I should be going to the gym and doing some sort of yoga or, all those things. I very much felt like that. And I am a person that likes trying lots of new things. And the temptation is always to fill your life with as much as you can, even when you're busy. But I was just like, you know what? On my list, I go for a walk probably once or twice a day. Or if I'm out and about, I get to walk anyway. I love weight training. I always have. That's what I do in the gym. And I do reformer and tower Pilates. And that is it. I don't suddenly go, oh, maybe I'll try take up jujitsu this week. And then the next week I'm going to do this. So it's very intentional and something that I aim to stay consistent with rather than jumping around everywhere.
I don't know if you come across this, but a couple of weeks ago, there was this discussion about Stephen Bartlett and his kind of way of optimizing his lifestyle, his health. It was such a backslash, wasn't it? It's not about more and better, and you need to measure every single second of your sleep and what you put into your body. It's more like understanding on the bigger screen, for example, what is enough, you know? And
It's interesting you use the Stephen Bartlett example because I do wonder sometimes, like, what would this guy be doing if he didn't have an audience?
that's a good question. Maybe we're going to ask him. I'm assuming he has a couple. Well, he's very active, and I'm assuming he will come up straight away with a couple of options. I would challenge him to sit down and really have a proper pause and think about it,
Yeah.
because he might just fall too quickly into these paths we were talking about, into these preset kind of guardrails. That's interesting.
Yeah. So that's health. That was a
Yeah, that's health.
yeah.
You
Uh,
mentioned the second one, creativity.
yeah. So right at the beginning when I was thinking about, well, actually, I'm not going to spend all of my time working, in inverted commas. What do I want to do to be more creative? And creativity for me personally has always been one of those things that always ended up on the back burner. And I hear this a lot from my coaching clients as well. Too busy. One of them said to me the other day, I'd really love to write children's books. Hadn't got round to it. So that's why I started my podcast initially. It's also why I've started writing more. But the biggest thing of all is I've allowed myself time to experiment. So that is quite a broad brush. But I think with the creativity, that's okay because it allows me to make mistakes, rather than saying, oh, that didn't work. By being creative, I can start all these little different projects. And if I don't enjoy them or I feel actually this is not an avenue that I want to go down anymore, I just stop.
What I like about this is creativity is sometimes a topic that we just let fall over, as you described. But you put it as one as your pillars. That means you deliberately make sure, you are actually facing this topic, creativity, what it means, and how you can define this and how you can fill your bucket, your pillar up with creativity because it's important for you, right?
As someone is a self-confessed starter of projects and not finisher, the temptation is always to start something and then feel terrible when you don't finish it. What I'm basically saying is enough is to experience my creativity by exploring ideas. Even if I work on something for a week and I go, actually, I'm going to close that off. It's more about feeling enough is to have tried rather than saying, oh, I've actually made a mistake here. So I think that's important when recognizing enough in relation to creativity for me personally.
Yeah. When you mention creativity, I just thought about you could take this pillar and apply this to your day-to-day life. For example, you can be creative in a lot of things. It does not always have to be you need to build something with your hands. I think you can be very creative of coming up with new ideas for your team, for example. Just about breaking out of this habit and being creative. Think differently.
Well, I think the biggest misconception with creativity is that you're creative or you're not. It's not binary. We often hear people labeled as a creative, and an accountant, for example, is not a creative. I mean, that's complete bollocks, frankly. So I think the important thing is in your life, wherever you're at now, recognizing, do you feel a lack? And if you feel a lack, what could you explore? And creativity is of these 5 pillars is the biggest one I think that you can give yourself permission to explore.
Yeah, I love that. Number 3 is peace.
Hmm.
What do you mean by
Yeah, I
peace?
mean, for me, this is feeling content, feeling at at ease, calm, however you want to label it. Some people would put meditation in here, for example. I listened to a really interesting podcast yesterday where the speaker was talking about doing nothing. So not even meditating, right? Just literally doing nothing. No phone. You're not allowed to, you just sit. I don't know how I feel about that, but that is also creating peace for quite a lot of people. And there's apparently a lot of research that's been done on this. For me personally, enough peace is being outside enough. So those 2 walks I talked about, they overlap into this as well. I also am lucky enough to have a garden, so I spend a lot of time in the garden. God, I sound like a retired person now, don't I? But that's what's important to me. Things like looking up at the stars on a clear night in the summer, that's also something that brings me a huge amount of peace. I've always loved the universe and looking up at the sky. But what's yours, Thomas? What would bring you peace?
Before we started this podcast, and this is what I'd like to do as a routine, is I do have a breather. I just inhale and exhale 3 times. I think that's important for me to start and show up 2 episodes in a peaceful kind of mind. So for me, that's important, just as an example. But on a broader level, it's finding space for me to go back and find my balance. And with that, what I mean is to find a balance between my physical activities, my mental health, my spirituality, and level it at some points. That's for me a very nice, peaceful state of mind that I'd like to be in. And often, as you know, we get derailed. Um, and I think coming back and understanding which level we need to dial back or dial up to just have this stage of peace. And I like walks too, and that's very peaceful sometimes to just stand still and be very mindful of the moment that you are in, listening to the wind.
Thomas, I'm going to challenge you on this because I know for a fact that you listen to podcasts when you walk. So I guess my challenge to you in the peace category this week or next week would be, can you go for a walk and just look around? No podcast,
Yeah.
do nothing and see how that, I'm going to try it myself because I'm similar to you. I usually have something else going on, but maybe stripping back some of these additional layers that we've created with technology, not all the time, but just sometimes to observe, because we don't do that very often in our day-to-day jobs, would give us actually more insight. I mean, how many times have you come up with a brilliant idea when you're walking around or doing something else rather than sitting at your laptop? Like, I can hands up say I've had about 1 idea sitting at my laptop in the last year, and I've probably had about 500 doing other things.
Can I just bring up this moment in the shower in the morning? A peaceful moment where a lot of ideas been born, right? And where people just start and allow themselves to think about new things and where ideas come up. But to answer your question or your challenge, I think for me, defining what's enough sometimes starts when I go off a train, for example, I arrive at my destination where I would like to do my walk and just think like, how do I feel now about things? Do I really want to have some external stimuli? Like, do I want to listen to a podcast and learn? Or is it actually time now to be in the here and now and to listen? And this is what I do.
Well, you've just given a very good example of being intentional.
And that is understanding what is enough for you and being intentionally and getting out of this river autopilot and go back into agency mode and just thinking and just making decisions for you. And sometimes it's not about this big decision. Shall I leave my job, for example? Maybe it's about the smaller things and the agencies that we have on a daily basis. And I think these examples are great. Let's move to number 4,
Mm.
connections. What does that mean for you?
Connection for me is about quality, not quantity. And I think that's a very important distinction. I wouldn't say that I ever struggled. I'm quite a sociable person, allegedly an extrovert. I mean, that's a whole other conversation. But I don't enjoy surface level conversations that much. I like getting to know people much more deeply. If you meet me at a party, I've probably met 5 people and know all of their life stories. Whereas another person at a party would have met everyone and will know a little something about them all. So for in terms of connection, that's what's become important for me. And we talked earlier about the event that we created. That's why it's small and you have a chance to speak to everyone and a chance to further those conversations if you want to after the event. So rather than what I felt forced to do in my corporate career, which was maintain connections, be visible, all that stuff, I now have a lot more agency to focus on the quality of relationships rather than the quantity. So I also run something called a growth lab, which I do every quarter. And I just invite people to come along and we discuss a particular topic. I don't do that because I'm trying to generate business. I do it because I want to be connected with people who think like me. It's as simple as that.
I love this topic, connection. And often we think our clients about the cadences, how we want to reach out, and or LinkedIn, building a personal brand. What is actually enough for your business?
Well, some
Right.
people love that stuff. Thomas, some people love that stuff. They love showing up on LinkedIn, doing the humble bragging, all of that. I personally, I enjoy some of it when it feels authentic, but most of the time it just feels like cringe. And I feel like sometimes I come off LinkedIn feeling like, who are these people? Like these weird imposters. You said something really interesting earlier, Thomas, about that question of what are you optimizing for? And I think this is a really good example with connection because when you think about those people that you were talking about, they want a mass audience. They need to appeal to everyone. They're trying to generate huge amounts of revenue. That isn't the business model that I have. I don't need I don't need a six-figure business. I've created a life where I am actually working more for fun now rather than looking at this as I need to generate money every month to live off. Because I've got a point in my life where I have optimized that part of my life. So I don't have to worry about paying my bills. So everything is a bonus. That sounds a very privileged position to get myself into, but I don't have a partner. I don't have children. You can say, that's the trade off. But I had to do everything myself. I was fortunate enough to work in very good jobs and I never overspent. So I allowed myself to get in a position where I was fortunate enough to be able to define what is enough to live, not what do I want to consume to make my life better. And I think that's the trap that a lot of people fall into is that they aren't really feeling unhappy, but they're not particularly happy either. And when it comes to their evenings and weekends, they're often spending to make themselves feel better. And I definitely had periods of my life when I did that too.
That brings me to thinking upstream, and it sounds like you made some very deliberate decisions in your life not to overspend, how you spend your time very wisely. Is that an advice that people should take away in their summer weeks now?
Well, I think it brings it very nicely into the fifth pillar, right, which is growth. I think often we are so focused on our professional growth in the middle of our careers. It's about getting the next promotion, learning new skills, but not necessarily skills that benefit you as an individual, because your identity is so tied to that profession. It's very hard to look outside of that. Yeah, some people have hobbies that they've been doing for years and things like that, but I'm talking about something different here, which is the ability to go, why am I doing this? What is my life really about? Which is something a little bit different. So, when you think about growth, what are the things that you've been putting on the back burner that you really want to do? Like for me, I've always wanted to learn Spanish, never had time. I've now decided that I'm going to travel around South America probably for the next 10 years, but I don't speak any Spanish. So I started Spanish 2 months ago and I'm going to Mexico in 4 months' time. So I've got a deadline to at least know some Spanish. But I'll be in Mexico and that'll be an opportunity for me to do local classes, and then it will kind of compound from there. So that's an example of being a lot more intentional about your why. Because this isn't about me learning a skill so I can get promoted or get more work. It's about creating a life that I go, wow, this is amazing because I'm doing all these things that I've been putting off for 20 years.
Mm. I really like this. And my personal story is a bit different to that because I thought like, oh, if I just run my own portfolio career, I will be traveling as well, right? And this was the reason why I've done that. Now looking back to my here, now I'm running my consultancy now for 2 years. I actually traveled less, which is interesting. So what I'm saying is finding your what is actually enough is a process. And sometimes you just stick to priorities that are still valid for you. I said, oh, I go to Paris. I learn more French. I haven't done that this summer, to be honest, because I was busy, but it's still there. And I'm still going to think about this, how I will do this.
I think those are all very admirable. And we can sit here as people that don't work full time currently because we're choosing not to. I think if I think back to how I was probably like 8, 10 years ago, I often felt very overwhelmed and trying to address this question. And even thinking about those 5 pillars would have been something that I would have gone, yeah, I'd love to do that, but it's actually quite difficult. So what I would encourage actually is to think, well, in order for me to get upstream, it's a series of swimming strokes. I was going to say steps, but we're not stepping up the river, we're swimming. It's one stroke at a time. So what are the everyday things that you can start to look at that will help you determine what enough is? Because I guarantee you there are things that you're doing every day where you're making decisions about what's enough here. So for example, is it enough for me to finish work at 6 p.m. or do I feel like I have to be looking at emails in the evening? Big one that I hear a lot. Have I achieved enough in my career? Do I actually want that next promotion? Because that, you know, that happened to me. I actually put myself in positions where I didn't really want to get promoted, and I would always kind of go for the sidestep position into a different role because that was much more interesting for me. I really wasn't bothered, but I think that takes a lot for people to admit. But resting on a question like that is kind of like a question that would appear every day. Do I really need to be in that meeting? So delegation is another thing that I would encourage people to think about enough. You're doing enough? Could you do even less? So those are just some examples of how it shows up in everyday life, really,
Mm.
before you start tackling kind of this big monster of the 5 pillars.
Angela, if there's one thing you want our listeners to take away for summer to think about what's actually enough, what would this be?
Well, actually, there was 2 things. Well, I had 2 things.
All right, go for 2 things.
The first one is don't change something immediately. I sort of alluded to this in what I was just saying, but start to observe. When are you saying yes to things when you really want to say no? Where's your energy going? Where it brings you joy? And where's it draining you? Doesn't require you to take any action. It just means to observe. And we're not very good at observing, actually, unless we do it intentionally. The second thing is I'm just thinking back to the Stephen Bartlett part of this conversation. And that is, would you still choose what you're doing if no one else was watching? So that I'd encourage people to think about that question as well. And what that will reveal, I think, is, am I making my decisions based on what someone else expects of me or a version that I'm performing rather than who I'm becoming?
Angela, how can people find you and how can they potentially work with you?
So for my sins, I am on LinkedIn. I also have an Instagram. I have a podcast called Change Unfiltered, and I have a companion Substack called Change Unfiltered, which is where I write. I honestly don't spend a huge amount of time on LinkedIn anymore, but I do reply to messages. But I assume, Thomas, you're going to put everything in the show notes anyway, so people have that contact information.
Absolutely. Angela, thank you so, so much. What we learned is, and what I appreciate you were sharing, these 5 pillars. Call it a framework or not, but I think it's a great way of just going through our lives and having some tick boxes or some structure to think about what's actually enough for us. And how can we just show up better, more content, happier, and roll with that. Thank you so much for being here, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you so much for having me, Thomas.